The baked earth of redemption shimmered under the oppressive summer sun, the heat a physical weight on Leanne's shoulders. Dust, fine as powdered cinnamon, coated the hem of her dark green prairie dress and settled in the lines of her worn leather gloves. She stood on the splintered planks of the train platform, a solitary figure of rigid composure, while inside her stomach twisted into a knot of desperate hope. The twice-weekly train from the east was late, each passing minute stretching her nerves thinner. She clutched the telegram in her hand. The paper softened with sweat. It confirmed the arrival of Mr. Alistair Abernathy, the man she had chosen from the pages of a matrimonial agency catalog. The description had promised a sturdy merchant of good character, with a photograph of a portly, kind-eyed man in his late 40s. A safe man, a respectable man, the kind of man who could stand beside her and convince the town banker that her late husband's business was a sound investment, not a widow's folly on the verge of collapse. The whistle shrieked in the distance, a mournful cry that pulled her from her thoughts. The locomotive, a great black beast breathing steam and smoke, chugged into view, its rhythmic clatter growing into a deafening roar. A few other townspeople shuffled on the platform, their faces curious, their gazes sliding over to her. She felt their stares like insects crawling on her skin. The widow who had to buy a husband. The train hissed to a stop, steel grinding against steel. A few passengers disembarked, a family with too much luggage, a tired-looking salesman. And then, him. He was not Mr. Abernathy. He was tall and lean, built of whipcord and shadow, his movements economical as he stepped from the carriage. The sun caught the weathered lines on his face, a face that looked as if it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape around them. A low-slung gun belt with a heavy, dark-handled pistol rested on his hip with an unnerving familiarity. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over the platform and landed on her, the only unescorted woman present. He started towards her. Panic seized Leanne's throat. This was not a merchant. This was a gunman. The station master, a balding man named Henry, scurried over to her, his expression a mixture of pity and unease. He avoided looking at the approaching stranger. "A letter for you, Mrs. Chen," he mumbled, thrusting a sealed envelope into her hand before retreating back into the safety of his office. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, as it always did in this town. The gunman stopped a few feet away from her, his silence a palpable force. He held a dusty canvas bag in one hand and simply waited, his gaze unwavering. Leanne's hands trembled, not from fear of him, but from the shattering of her carefully constructed plan. She tore open the envelope. The letter was from the agency, the handwriting a frantic scrawl. "Deepest apologies. Unforeseen tragedy. Mr. Abernathy succumbed to a sudden fever." The words blurred. Her hope, so fragile, crumbled into dust. "In accordance with our agreement to provide a suitable partner, and given the urgency of your request, we have sent a replacement. Mr. Nash comes with references of a different sort. He is a man of considerable skill, known for his reliability and protective instincts. We are confident he will be an asset in the untamed territories." Protective instincts. An asset. These were words used for a guard dog, not a husband. She looked up from the letter, her eyes stinging with unshed tears of pure, unadulterated rage. "There has been a mistake," she said, her voice tight and brittle. She held out the letter for him to see. He didn't take it. His gaze dropped to the paper, read the words upside down from where he stood, and then returned to her face. "No mistake," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was the voice of a man who didn't waste words. "I am Nash." "I ordered a merchant," she snapped, the sound sharp in the sweltering air. "A partner to help me run a business, not—" She gestured helplessly, furiously at the gun on his hip. Not this!" He didn't flinch. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of stoicism that gave nothing away. He simply stood there, an unmovable object that had just crashed into the wreckage of her life. She had paid the last of her savings for a lifeline, and they had sent her an anchor. Leanne turned on her heel, the crisp fabric of her dress swirling around her ankles, and marched away from the platform. She would not acknowledge him. She would not accept this catastrophic error. She would leave him standing in the dust, a monument to her folly, and he could take the next train back to wherever he came from. But the sound of steady boot falls on the wooden planks behind her told her it would not be so simple. He was following. Not closely, but at a deliberate, respectful distance that was somehow more infuriating than if he had tried to grab her arm. The town of Redemption was laid out before her, a single dusty street flanked by tired-looking wooden buildings. Every window felt like an eye. She saw Sheriff Brody leaning against a post outside his office, his arms crossed, his gaze sharp and assessing as it fell on her and the tall shadow trailing her. Further down, Mr. Finch, the banker, stood outside the saloon. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that was more of a mockery than a courtesy, his lips curled into a thin, predatory smile. He had been circling her business, Chin's Mercantile, for months, ever since her husband's death. He smelled weakness, and now she was walking through town with a hired gun at her back. What would he make of that? Her cheeks burned with humiliation. She had tried so hard to maintain an air of respectable dignity, to prove that a Chinese woman, a widow, could succeed on her own terms in this harsh land. She had needed a partner to project an image of stability. Instead, she had imported instability, a walking, breathing personification of the violence that simmered just beneath the surface of this frontier life. She reached the Mercantile, its faded blue paint peeling under the relentless sun. The sign, Chin's Mercantile, General Goods and Supplies, swung on a creaking hinge. It was her legacy, her prison, and her only hope. She fumbled with the key, her hands still shaking, and pushed the door open, stepping into the familiar scent of dry goods, leather, and old wood. She glanced back. Nash had stopped across the street, his back to the livery stable. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt his presence as a constant, unnerving pressure. He was waiting. She spent the afternoon in a daze of fury and despair, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of work. She restocked shelves of canned peaches, measured out bolts of calico, and tallied figures in a ledger that only told a story of dwindling profits and mounting debt. But every time the bell above the door jingled, her heart leaped into her throat, expecting him. It was always just a customer, their curious eyes lingering a moment too long. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, Garrett stumbled into the store. He was one of Finch's men, a lout with mean eyes and a perpetual sneer, who did odd jobs for the banker, most of them unpleasant. He reeked of cheap whiskey. "Evening, Mrs. Chin," he slurred, leaning heavily on the counter. "Heard you got some company. A real tough fella, they say." Leanne ignored him, continuing to wipe down the polished wood of the counter. "If you are not here to purchase anything, Garrett, the door is right there." He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Oh, I'm thinking of making a purchase. Finch says you're in a bind. Maybe you'd be willing to sell cheap. Real cheap." He reached out, his grimy hand closing over her wrist. "Or maybe we can work out some other kind of payment." Before the scream could form in her throat, the light from the doorway was blocked by a tall silhouette. Nash was there. He moved with a silent swiftness that was terrifying. He didn't speak. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply placed his hand on the counter next to Garrett's, the quiet thud of his palm on the wood echoing in the sudden silence. Garrett looked at the hand, then up at the cold, unblinking eyes of the man it belonged to. All the drunken bravado drained from his face, replaced by a primal, animal fear. He snatched his hand back from Leanne's wrist as if he'd been burned. "Just looking around," he stammered, backing away towards the door. No harm done. Nash didn't move until Garrett had scrambled out into the street. Leanne stood frozen, rubbing her wrist, the ghost of Garrett's touch still on her skin. She looked at Nash, at the raw, controlled power he radiated. He had protected her, and it horrified her. "I did not ask for your help," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. He finally turned his gaze to her. "You didn't have to," he replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. Sleep offered no escape that night. Leanne lay in her small apartment above the store, the summer heat making the sheets stick to her skin. Every creak of the old building, every distant shout from the saloon sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She finally rose and went to the window, peering down into the moonlit street. And there he was. He wasn't at the livery. He was sitting on the edge of the horse trough across the street, a motionless silhouette in the darkness. He was watching the store. He was watching over her. The realization sent a strange, unwelcome flutter through her chest. It wasn't comfort. It was a profound sense of complication. In the morning, when she went to open the shutters, she found the one on her bedroom window, which had been hanging crookedly for weeks, was now firmly fixed in place. The hinge was oiled, the wood secured. She hadn't heard a thing. She found him out back, splitting firewood with a steady, powerful rhythm. He had already stacked a neat cord against the wall. She marched up to him, her resolve hardened by the light of day. She held out a small cloth pouch of coins. "This is for your time," she said, her voice formal. "It is enough for a ticket back east, with plenty left over. The contract is void. There was no wedding. You are free to go." Nash paused, the axe resting on the chopping block. He looked at the pouch in her hand, then met her eyes. His were clear and direct. "The agency paid my passage here. A contract was made. I honor my contracts." "The contract was for a Mr. Abernathy, who is dead," she cried, exasperated. "It has nothing to do with you." "They sent me in his place," he stated, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "The debt is owed. The work must be done." She saw then that he was bound by something more rigid than any piece of paper, a personal code she couldn't begin to understand. Defeated, she tried a different tactic. "Fine," she sighed, withdrawing the money. "A new arrangement. You may stay in the spare room. You will work for your room and board. You will be an employee. Nothing more. Do you understand?" He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single, decisive nod. And with that, an uneasy truce was declared. He settled into the life of the mercantile with a quiet efficiency that was both a relief and a constant source of tension. He was an indefatigable worker. He unloaded freight wagons before the sun was fully up, his muscles cording as he lifted heavy crates of goods. He mended the leaky section of the roof that had plagued her all spring, and reinforced the back door with an iron strap. He was always present, a silent, watchful force at the edge of her world. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and he never, ever spoke of his past. For Leanne, this created a strange domesticity. They worked side by side, their days measured by the ringing of the shop bell and the setting of the sun, yet they remained miles apart. She buried herself in the ledgers, the columns of numbers a testament to her slow failure. The debt to Finch's bank was a noose, and every week it tightened. One afternoon the banker himself paid a visit. Mr. Finch entered the store with a cloud of cloying cologne, his polished shoes clicking on the floorboards. "My dear Mrs. Chin," he began, his voice oozing a false sympathy that made her skin crawl. "I was just reviewing your accounts. The loan extension comes up for review next week." He let the words hang in the air. "Of course, a respectable establishment run by a woman of your standing should have no trouble, provided you have the right kind of support." His gaze slid past her, landing on Nash, who was methodically stocking tins of beans on a high shelf. Finch's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "New hired help?" The question was an insult, a clear insinuation that she couldn't manage on her own. Leanne felt a surge of defiant pride. She straightened her spine. "He is my partner," she said, the word feeling strange and momentous on her tongue. It was a lie, a shield, a declaration of war. She risked a glance at Nash. He had stopped his work, a can held motionless in his hand. His back was to them, but she knew he had heard. He didn't turn, didn't react, but the stillness that came over him was more potent than any word. Finch's smile tightened. "I see," he said slowly. "We will see." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving a chill in the warm afternoon air. Leanne let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had drawn a line in the sand, and she had placed Nash firmly on her side of it. The fragile peace of their arrangement was shattered a few days later. A lone rider, caked in the dust of a long journey, trotted his weary horse down the main street. He was heading for the saloon when his eyes fell on Nash, who was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. The man's face, already weathered and tan, went pale as a sheet. His hand twitched towards the pistol on his hip, but then he seemed to think better of it. With a furtive, terrified glance over his shoulder, he wrenched his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest, and spurred it into a gallop, fleeing town as if the devil himself were on his heels. Leanne watched the entire exchange from the store window, her heart pounding. The fear on that man's face was raw and unmistakable. It wasn't the fear of a common outlaw. It was the terror of a man who had seen a ghost. Who was Nash? What kind of past could make a hardened man run like that? That evening, the air in the small apartment was thick with unspoken questions. She found him at the small kitchen table, the parts of his pistol laid out neatly on an oilcloth. He was cleaning it by the light of a single kerosene lamp, his movements methodical and sure. The lamplight glinted off the polished steel, making the weapon seem like a living thing. The sight no longer filled her with immediate revulsion, but with a deep, unsettling curiosity. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Who are you running from, Nash?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't look up immediately. He continued wiping down the barrel with a soft cloth, his focus absolute. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were dark pools of shadow. "Not who," he said, his voice low. "What?" "I'm running from a man I used to be." It was more than he had ever told her. He didn't offer details of gunfights or crimes, but he spoke of a promise made to a dying friend, a vow to lay down his gun and live a quiet life. "I owe a debt," he finished, his gaze distant, "one that can't be paid with money." In that moment she saw past the gunman. She saw a man shackled to his own history, seeking a redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. Finch was not a man to be deterred by a silent partner. If he couldn't intimidate Leanne directly, he would attack the foundation of her life, her business. His threats became more pointed, his visits more frequent. He spoke of foreclosure as an inevitability. Then he escalated. One moonless night, a flicker of orange light against the back wall of the store caught Leanne's eye from her window. A smell, acrid and sharp, drifted on the air. Smoke. Panic, cold and sharp, shot through her. She grabbed the water bucket from the washstand and flew down the back stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The small storeroom, filled with dry goods and her entire winter inventory, was her lifeblood. As she burst through the back door, she saw them, Garrett and two of his cronies, their faces illuminated by the small, greedy fire they had set against the wooden wall. Before she could even scream, a dark shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the alley. It was Nash. He moved with a brutal, silent grace. There were no gunshots, no wasted movements. The scene unfolded in a series of swift, violent tableaus. The sickening crunch of a fist meeting a jaw. A choked cry as a man was thrown against a stack of empty barrels. The dull thud of a body hitting the hard-packed earth. It was over in seconds. He disabled them with a terrifying efficiency, leaving them groaning and incapacitated in the dirt. Leanne rushed forward, throwing the contents of the bucket onto the flames, which hissed and died, leaving a blackened, smoking scar on the wall. The immediate danger was gone. She stood there, her chest heaving, the empty bucket hanging from her hand. She looked at the wreckage of the men on the ground, and then at Nash, who stood over them, his breathing even, his expression as impassive as ever. In the flickering moonlight, he looked like an avenging spirit. And for the first time since he had stepped off that train, she felt no fear of the violence within him. She felt only a profound, dizzying wave of gratitude. He was not the cause of the violence in her life. He was the shield against it. The failed arson attempt was Finch's last clumsy effort. His final move was one of cold, legal precision. The next morning he walked into the mercantile, and this time he was not alone. Sheriff Brody walked beside him, his face grim, a sheaf of official-looking papers in his hand. The banker's smile was triumphant. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Finch said, his tone dripping with finality. "As per the terms of your loan agreement, which you have failed to meet, the note is now called. Payment is due in full, immediately. Sheriff Brody is here to execute the foreclosure." The words struck Leanne with the force of a physical blow. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it was suffocating. "You can't," she whispered, her hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. "The terms were predatory. The contract is invalid." It was a desperate bluff, a dying ember of defiance. Sheriff Brody looked at her with something like regret. "I'm sorry, Leanne. The law is the law. His paperwork is in order. If you can't produce the $200, I have to lock the doors." $200. It might as well have been $2 million. Every cent she had was tied up in the stock surrounding them, stock that would soon be auctioned off for pennies on the dollar by Finch. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. It was over. All her work, her husband's legacy, turned to ash. As Finch stepped forward, ready to savor his victory, a heavy leather pouch landed on the counter with a solid, definitive thud. It was Nash. He had been standing by the back room, a silent observer until now. He stepped up beside Leanne, his presence a solid wall between her and the banker. "The debt is paid," he said, his voice calm and even. He untied the drawstring, and a river of gold coins spilled onto the polished wood, gleaming in the morning light. There was far more than $200 there. It was a small fortune. Finch stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. Where did you get that?" he sputtered, his eyes wide. "That's stolen money." Nash calmly produced a folded, worn piece of paper from his pocket. A bill of sale for gold dust, cashed and converted to coin in a town 3 states away. It was dated over a year ago. "I've been saving for a piece of land," Nash said, his gaze as cold and hard as the coins on the counter. "But my plans have changed." Sheriff Brody inspected the bill of sale, then counted out the required amount from the pile of gold, his movements slow and deliberate. He pushed the remaining coins back towards Nash. He handed the payment to a sputtering, apoplectic Finch, along with a receipt marking the debt as paid in full. The banker snatched the money and the paper, his face a mask of thwarted greed. He shot a look of pure venom at Leanne and Nash before turning and storming out of the store, slamming the door behind him. The sheriff lingered for a moment. He looked from Leanne's stunned face to Nash's calm one. He nodded once, a gesture of respect, and followed the banker out, leaving them in a profound, ringing silence. The mercantile, which had just been moments from being lost, was now irrevocably hers. The air was thick with everything that had not been said. Leanne stared at the pile of gold, the symbol of his sacrificed future, then at the empty leather pouch. "That was everything," she said softly. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of the sheer magnitude of his sacrifice. He had given up his dream of a quiet life, the one thing he had been working towards, for her. Nash turned to face her, and for the first time the stoic mask slipped. She saw a flicker of something raw and vulnerable in his stormy eyes. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the still room. "A quiet life isn't a place you go to. It's a person." His words hung in the air between them, a confession more intimate than a touch. In that instant, the last of her fear, the last of her resentment, dissolved completely. He wasn't the gunman she hadn't ordered. He was the partner she never knew she needed, a man who honored contracts of the heart, not just of paper. Slowly, deliberately, Leanne walked behind the counter and retrieved the tattered letter from the matrimonial agency, the one that had brought him here. She looked at it for a long moment. Then, with steady hands, she tore it into small pieces and let them fall like confetti into the wastebasket below. She looked up at him, a small, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "The agency made a mistake," she said, her voice clear and strong. "They sent the wrong letter." She paused, her gaze holding his. "My husband arrived right on schedule."